One of the things that you might remember about Linda Brown in the early days is at Building Excellent Schools, she singularly focused into helping create leaders that were going to go launch schools. And I think there's some inspiration in that as we all find our North Star and our why and our zone of genius. What are we so passionate about that we do for free? I'm sure Linda got paid, but she'd have done it for free. You could see her passion, her energy, her commitment for her life.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom. Powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Welcome back, friends, to the Bold by Choice podcast. I'm your host, Vashanta Harris. And in our last episode, we explored the passage of charter school laws, the debates, the politics, the compromises that made the charter idea legal across the states. But laws alone don't teach a child how to read. They don't open a classroom, hire a teacher, or design curriculum. For the charter promise to really mean anything, someone had to step forward very bravely and urgently to make it real. And today I'm super excited that we are focusing on some of the very first generations of founders who did that very thing. They weren't cut from one specific cloth. Some were teachers, some were entrepreneurs, policymakers, businessmen and women, and their paths may have been widely different, but they shared one thing. They chose to reimagine public schools, not just respond to the system they inherited. And in so doing, they sparked models that would touch thousands of schools and hundreds and thousands of students across the states.
Vashanta, what's going to be so fun about this is the stories of the people we're going to profile in this episode are people that you walk by on the street and you just never know. You never know the spark, the vision, the dreams that they have. And they all started small. They all started humbly. But what they've built, what it's grown into, the impact that it's had, now we revere them and we honor them and we point to them as exemplars. And so for all those listening out there with an idea, a spark, we hope you come away with even more inspiration to believe, to be courageous, and to try and put those dreams into action. I want to pull in our colleagues. We've got Ember Reichkot-Young and Don Cooper, and they're going to help us bring some color to the stories today and to the people. And that's what the Founders Library is really about. It's about the people, the policies, and the practices, and how together we prove the promise of a chartering. As we're fond of saying, chartering isn't a law, it isn't a contract, it isn't a process, it's a promise, and we prove it together. So, team, let's get about proving the promise and telling the stories of these key founders.
Well, let's start this segment with someone whose story is both personal and I believe catalytic for the entire charter movement. And that's Dave Levin, co-founder of KIPP, the Knowledge is Power program. After graduating from Yale, Dave joined Teach for America in Houston, where he taught sixth grade under the mentorship of a legendary educator named Harriet Ball. And it was in that classroom, watching Harriet work her magic, that Dave saw firsthand what great teaching looks like, what it sounds like, and even what it feels like. He even mentions in his story that it can feel like love, every single student feeling respected for who they are. And in 1994, he and fellow teacher and his other co-founder, Mike Feinberg, launched KIPP with 47 fifth graders. But this wasn't just about a classroom, it was about a philosophy that kids from any zip code could achieve at the highest levels when given excellent teaching, supportive school culture, and a strong commitment to character. Today, KIPP is one of the most influential charter networks in the country, with hundreds of schools and thousands of students, and an outsized impact on how we think about scale, quality, and even equity for students. So let's step into the Dave Levin story. So Jim, I was listening to the oral history that we have on Dave, and he talks about eating lunch in Harriet Ball's classroom for weeks and begging her to officially mentor him. And he says he kind of watches her teach not only the fun elements like the chants and the songs that we kind of know about, but he also witnessed what I believe is super important, the amount of heavy lifting that students were doing cognitively in her classroom. And he says it's a magical interplay between the stuff kids find fun, but also the stuff that's really hard, but her students believe that they could do. So I wanted to start by sharing more of Dave's early days and how those experiences shaped his leadership.
What's fascinating about that story is without Teach for America, I'd wager David Levin probably wouldn't have got into education and he wouldn't be part of the founding of KIPP. And so shout out for Teach of America and all the people that it brought into education. But what you heard there is somebody that saw excellence in action and wanted to be around it, wanted to study it, wanted to learn from it, wanted to figure out how they could put that into action in their own craft. And that's what winners do. Like they like to hang around other winners. I had a privilege to actually meet Harriet Ball. At the time I was at Central Michigan University, and boy, when you saw her work, it was a force of nature. And we invited her in to work with all the schools we chartered and to share her craft. But the magic of Harriet is she believed in the kids, she believed in their potential, but she knew how to engage them in a way that it was the joy of learning. And it was focused. Every minute was used. And that was part of her legacy is she had a way to bring the best out of people.
Jim, I just want to go back to something that you touched on with Teach for America and the importance of that organization, not just in the charter community, but within education reform in general. And if we go back to 1994, TFA was relatively new at the time. So TFA was, I think, founded, its first cohort was 1990, somewhere in that area. So Dave Levin and Mike Feinberg would have been in one of the earlier cohorts. By design, TFA was not bringing in educators. It was bringing in people who were going to be future leaders in other areas to public education. It was a short-term commitment, just 2 years. So it really was remarkable in design that it was meant to expose other people who didn't necessarily see themselves going into education to allow them to provide some time and talent to improve the system while they were there.
Don, you're so right. And I would say Teach for America was not only an attractor of talent and passion and energy, but an incubator. I mean, look at the people that are doing all sorts of amazing things today that have come through Teach for America. But I want to say something about Teach for America and chartering. In the early days, both chartering and Teach for America were viewed as not real. Charters weren't real public schools, and Teach for America wasn't a real teacher program. The establishment that they were challenging, if you will, didn't like them, didn't think they should exist, didn't think they were real, didn't think they were credible. And yet the power and the perseverance and the results have proven differently.
And Jim, that's really interesting because we think about KIPP, they started with just 47 students, if I have it right. And today is a national brand and a national name. What do you think it was about Dave's vision or the way he executed on it that made that leap so possible?
It worked. I mean, KIPP produced results. Their families were engaged. Their teachers were engaged. People were proud to be, quote, KIPPsters. And then they had backing, right? Success begets success. And so 47 fifth graders, kind of a wing and a prayer to now a national brand and a model featured on 60 Minutes. But, that's how all things get started. For those of us that take our families to Disney, right? Walt Disney started and went broke 7 times, but he kept going. And that's part of the story of chartering and the pioneers. Ember worked 3 years to get the law passed. Teresa Lubbers in Indiana, 7 years to get the law passed. It takes time, it takes hard work, and it takes perseverance, and it takes fortitude. But those are the things that pay off in the long run. It's just like learning too, in a way, right? You don't just all of a sudden have education. You got to go through some struggle. You got to go through some work.
Yeah, Vashanta, part of the reason KIPP had success was because KIPP was able to produce more Harriet Balls. So oftentimes we think of teaching, the characteristics that make a really great teacher is something that's intrinsic to the individual. And what KIPP has proven is that with the right systems, the right education, the right motivation, that's something that can be conveyed, it can be replicated and scaled so more great teachers can help more kids get results.
What the founders, Dave and Mike, instilled in their team was that they could have high expectations for their students. Most of their students in the KIPP schools are of color. And in the district schools, sometimes the expectations just weren't there for them, or they would give up on them. But this particular network was focused on high expectations that every child could go to college. And so that was really important. I think the other thing from a policy perspective that was important about KIPP is that it became one of the first national networks that was nonprofit and was able to take their brand of learning, their success, their results to other schools. And that was one of the first ones. That was pretty early because remember in Minnesota, we were talking about starting new schools, individual schools, new. And this was a very different approach.
Absolutely. Well, I'm super pumped because we've got several folks we're going to talk about today. And I want to transition us to the story of J.C. Huizenga. And from the Midwest came this founder who believed that tools of the business world could be harnessed for public good. And J.C. Huizenga wasn't an educator by training. He was definitely an entrepreneur, steeped in classical economics and influenced by thinkers like Milton Friedman. We were actually talking about that earlier today. And in the mid 1990s, he launched National Heritage Academies, quickly growing a network of schools that married efficiency with a clear mission: drive quality up while keeping costs sustainable. And parents responded. I recall him saying he was really surprised by the initial amount of parents who applied to the school. And they placed trust in this model that promised rigor and the ability to be replicated. And his approach was controversial at times, if we're being honest, but it did help solidify the idea that charters could operate at scale, like almost no reform before then. And so let's step into our first question. JC entered chartering from outside education. Let's begin there. Let's pull out some of those elements. How does JC's entry point into chartering really form this later national CMO?
So JC is a lot of things, and one of them most recently is he's a member of the National Charter School Hall of Fame. In 2025 at the national conference, he was inducted and well deserved. They've just celebrated 30 years at National Heritage Academies. But his story begins different than that. He was a college student. He liked Milton Friedman, free market philosophy, but he was a business guy and he was part of the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. And the president of the chamber, who's now our board chair at the National Charter School Institute, is a guy named Jim Barrett. And Jim had the chamber involved in education. So when we talk today about the business community being involved, here's a great story of what it can do. They chartered a plane and they took a group of 10 or 12 people down to Texas to see a school run by a gentleman named Thaddeus Lott. And this was a school where the kids were doing amazing things. I remember in fifth grade, they all came back talking about what these kids were doing with Shakespeare. They watched the parents come in the morning and leave in the evening and picking up and dropping their kids off. The joy of learning, the love. And that sparked JC to come back and take Michigan's new charter school law and decide to do something with it.
Yeah, Vashanta, right about that time, too, JC's first son, David, was born. And at some point, chartering stopped being a matter of public policy for him and started being a personal policy for him. And one thing he'd tell you if he was with us today, here in the studio today, is that he wanted to build the type of school that he could send his son to. So that was really his inspiration, marrying the personal desire to build great schools for kids with his interest and passion for public policy that was sparked by the chamber.
That's absolutely right. He actually mentions that in his oral history, which is amazing, by the way. So if those of you who want to hear more, please listen in at the Founders Library. One thing I'd love to hear you all unpack as well, what were some of the more structural innovations that he brought about that distinguished his work from other first generation founders?
That's a great question. And if JC were sitting at this microphone, he'd say sustainability. So when he set out to build National Heritage Academies, he wanted to deliver a great education for kids. He either wanted to be the best or join the best, but wanted to do it in a way that was sustainable. So that meant having a fiscal discipline. That meant having purchasing power and economies of scale that a larger organization can bring. That meant having a process in relationships to build new school facilities in a way that got buildings constructed on time and complete and on budget or under budget. So all the things that made for his success in the business world made for his success in the education space too. And Jim, I know you were there in some of those early days, and JC had worked with a lot of people who were educators. So maybe you'd like to share a little bit about that.
Well, we featured Pat Sandro, and Pat was the former superintendent of Grand Rapids, went on to lead Grand Valley State University's chartering schools office, and just a great guy. But I'd been hearing from Pat about this guy named JC, and I'm standing in line at the Governor's Education Summit, and my last name's Gunner, his is Huizenga, and we just happened to be signing up at the same time, and we met in person, and well, now we've had 30 years of a lot of fun together. But what JC brought was capital. And what charter schools lacked in those early days was capital. We often call it facilities financing. But he was able to bring a business sense, a strategic sense, capital for startup. But he also was trying to get it right with the first school. It was the first school, but it also was a prototype. It was a testing ground. And if he could get that one right, he could do the next one. And what happened was the parents absolutely loved the school. It had a waiting list. And they started saying, can you do more? Can you do more?
So, one of the things that comes to my mind with all of this is that he was the entrepreneur of chartering. And that, what you guys have talked about as far as all the things he brought to the school and his skill sets, are many of the skill sets that school leaders need today. They're not just educators, they are entrepreneurs. So I think he was the first to really show that you have to have that business sense to make the school sustainable, as Don said, to make it successful, as well as the skills of an educator on the academic side. That was important.
Absolutely. So next, we turn to someone who carried the charter idea into the fabric of California schools, and in doing so, helped invent an entirely new model for growth. Don Shalvey is a long-term educator. So he was a superintendent in San Carlos who didn't just open a school, but really a pathway. In 1992, he founded California's first charter school. By the late 1990s, he was building Aspire Public Schools. It's one of the first group of the nation's first charter management organizations, which we often refer to as CMOs. And Aspire showed that innovation didn't have to be one-off or boutique. It could be organized and scaled and sustained. And along the way, I love the story that Don tells in his oral history because he partners with a lot of maybe unexpected allies. He talks about his interaction with President then Bill Clinton, to Silicon Valley entrepreneurs like Reed Hastings, proving that education reform could draw strength from cross-sector collaboration. And so let's go into the first question here. When we think about Don Shalvey, he comes from the traditional superintendent world. And he tells this story about he's in this legislative session and a man who he doesn't know at the time walks up and introduces himself and kind of starts talking to him. That man is who we know now as Reed Hastings. So I want to start with this. How did the work between Don and Reed together play out and later lead to the birth of Aspire Public Schools?
Well, Vashanta, for all our listeners, we better tell who Reed Hastings is for those that don't know. Founder and CEO of Netflix. And so Reed knows about growth, he knows about scale, but he also had some money to help fuel it. And Don and Reed's relationship at the beginning of charters in California, the birth of Aspire, their friendship and their passion for making a difference really were a powerful combination. And Don came from inside public education. He was a veteran, and yet he saw that chartering could provide a better way, a greater path to create impact and to do that at scale. And that's the beginning of the story.
Yeah, that's right. And Don's path was very similar to a lot of other school founders. He began as an assistant superintendent in the farming community of Lodi, California, got his superintendency in San Carlos in the Silicon Valley, was able to open up one of the first charter schools in the state. Because of his relationships with the teachers and the unions, he wasn't opposed, so was able to do good things. And uh, a good question is, how did he get hooked up with Reed Hastings? And that way is through the policy. So he and Reed had worked together at first to change state charter law to eliminate that 100 school cap that existed in California at the time to allow for more growth. And then after they saw some success in that, it became the question of implementation. Who's going to do it? And Shalvey was the natural, and Reed was able to bring some resources in on that.
One of the things I think is unique about this story is that Don did come from the traditional superintendent world. And I remember in Minnesota, when some of the superintendents of districts testified at the legislature saying they wanted charter schools or chartering, and legislators were like, really? You know, they had everything they needed for their particular district. So these superintendents who came forward were breaking the mold. You have to understand, they were breaking the mold of traditional education in a way that had never been seen before. And I think that's important. It just gave new weight to them as pioneers.
Yeah, let's talk about the innovation piece. So, what were some of the innovations that Don really introduced, and how did that change the trajectory for charter schools nationally?
Yeah, so the big innovation that I think Don Shalvey's known for is the CMO. So up until 1998 in California, charters kind of followed the same model. One charter was issued to one school board that then operated one school. So for listeners who stayed with us through the California and Colorado episode, they might remember Bill Owens talking about a single school district that was charters in Colorado. What Don did, and the innovation that Don was able to implement, was to have one charter, one board, and multiple schools under it. So today we call that a CMO. It changed the way that board governance worked because he was able to consolidate back office operations and governance a little more effectively than had been done in the past to allow for scale and growth.
I think the other thing that is unique about Don, but not unique about so many of the people we talk about, is he was a teacher. And I don't just mean a teacher in the classroom. He taught everybody that interacted with him. He had a word of encouragement. He had a word of wisdom. He had a vision that he'd plant. You know, for people that had a spark, Don gave them fuel. I know a few times my interactions with him, just a few things he'd say, they're the things that linger with you. You think about, you remember years later. He was a unique person who just was kind, but a leader and a thought provoker.
And what he told me at one point is that chartering is the art of possibility for America's youth.
And we love that word, possibility. And our next founder did too. She didn't stop at building one school. Linda Brown built the builders in a sense through building excellent schools. Linda created a fellowship that identified, trained, and launched hundreds of school leaders across the country. And she's described as relentless, mentoring leaders, demanding excellence, and insisting that teaching, curriculum, and culture were absolute non negotiables for great schools who are going to get great results for students. And her work meant that entire cities began to experience exactly what was possible, not through one leader or one model, but through a pipeline of leaders equipped to serve kids with excellence. And in the story that there were a few folks really honoring Linda, they shared that she sort of obsessed over teaching curriculum and culture. How did that focus shape the DNA of the schools that came out of the BES fellowship?
Well, before we get to that, Vashant, I just kind of want to go back on what the BES Fellowship is. So before this segment, we talked about three networks, okay? KIPP and National Heritage Academies and Aspire. And when you're with a network like that, uh, and you're looking to grow, there's a lot of consideration about where the school is, how you're going to site the school, how the student population you're going to serve, and school leaders are grown from within the organization to be able to populate and bring over some of that organizational DNA to the new school. BES was very different because rather than looking to where the organization should grow, BES invested in the leader to make sure that they got the leadership right with that can-do attitude for kids. So those leaders could go into places that maybe the networks hadn't thought of or weren't there yet. So in a lot of ways, BES and its leadership development filled in the gaps of what the networks just weren't able to do at that time. And to me, that is fascinating because that's really helped complete the growth of charters over the years.
Don, good insight. And one of the themes that we've talked about throughout this is charters are an idea, charters are a law, but they're a promise that has to be implemented. And Linda made such a difference at building excellent schools by helping develop the leaders that were going to go out across the country and implement the idea on the ground with real students and real teachers. And she was a force of nature. She had a unique ability to recruit people, to build them, break them. Like, she was tough. And she also built them back up in a way that they were ready to go conquer the world. Um, that theme we've talked about, anything is possible. With Linda, high beliefs, high expectations, can do attitude, no excuses. Um, and she created a force of school leaders that you can see across the country today, and they run some of the best performing charter schools there are.
I think that's why Linda Brown is part of the National Charter Schools Hall of Fame, as well as Don Shalvey for good reason. And it was all about leadership. And they were the leaders that were emulating what that meant for others.
Amber, one of the things that you might remember about Linda Brown in the early days is she was at the Massachusetts Charter School Resource Center in 1993. And so she saw charters and chartering from that perch. And it wasn't until 2001 when she went and created and founded and built Building Excellent Schools. But I want all the listeners to hear that her role evolved, her focus evolved. As a resource center, you're doing more broad based things and activities. At Building Excellent Schools, she's singularly focused into helping create leaders that were going to go launch schools. And I think there's some inspiration in that as we all find our North Star and our why and our zone of genius. What are we so passionate about that we do for free? I'm sure Linda got paid, but she'd have done it for free. You could see her passion, her energy, her commitment for her life. Like, as long as I knew Linda, this was what she was about.
And the other thing you mentioned is a resource center, and that was just critical in the early states to have a resource center or a group of friends or supporters for chartering because they'd struggled when they started. And we saw that in Minnesota with John Schrader and the Charter School Friends Network. But she did that in Massachusetts, which is why Massachusetts was one of the early leaders of chartering.
And in that vein, our final founder, for purposes of this episode, has us to travel to Memphis and to a story rooted in justice. Roblyn Webb began her career as an attorney, very committed to civil rights. But after mentoring students on a mock trial team, she saw up close how systemic inequities limited their futures. And she talks about that in her interview. And she noticed that even students who would pass the state test were in some ways kind of locked out of college opportunities due to their scores on things like the SAT and the ACT. And that realization pushed her to, some would say, maybe unwillingly start Freedom Prep in 2009, as she tells in her story, which is now an unapologetically college prep school with a mission to ensure all of the students, but especially those that fit the Memphis demographic, could achieve at the highest levels and be able to access a college education. And today, Freedom Prep has grown into a network defined by culture, rigor, and community trust. And Roblin describes that realizing that education and not law was the modern civil rights movement. How does her entry point reflect the justice-centered origins of some of the charters?
Well, I want to jump in first on Roblin. Roblin is made such an impact, and she serves on the National Charter School Founders Library Advisory Board. But we featured a segment with her some time ago, not on the podcast, but in a webinar, where Roblin and three of her teachers interacted with Ted Coldery. Now, Ted at the time was 93, 94 years old. These teachers were 23, 24 years old. But what was so beautiful about it was the idea and the evolution and the youth implementing it today. And Ted felt so compelled that, boy, all of this work, all these policy ideas, here it was 30 years later, and these teachers were carrying it on. And one of those teachers was somebody that was in the first class of 100 sixth graders at Freedom Prep Academy that Roblin Webb founded. Had graduated, gone on, came back to give back.
So, Vashanta, connecting the idea to Roblin Webb and her work, one of the defining characteristics of the charter school idea was that it would create an open sector for people who did not come through the traditional public education training system, your teachers, your school leaders, to be able to innovate and do good things for kids. So in that way, that open sector was the experimentation, the design, trying to be able to do new things. So you really got to ask yourself, if we didn't have charters, would Roblin have even had the opportunity to get engaged for kids? I don't really think so. And I'm glad that she did, and that she's doing such great things for kids and continuing that civil rights focus to make college a reality for more students in Memphis and beyond.
Well, and that focus has gone well beyond the South. We have that here in Minnesota, the civil rights focus in some of our schools here. So again, she initiated an idea, not just a network.
And I love in her story, she says that she didn't choose to start a school, that the universe chose her. What does that tell us about the calling, I'm going to say, about some of the first generation of founders?
I think it
Vashanta,
really speaks. No, go ahead, Jim.
That calling is, I think, what makes the charter schools a movement. And it's why we're part of something bigger. It was a call to do choice, to have an open sector, but it was also a call to address injustice. And I think Roblin exemplifies somebody that saw injustice in Memphis and across the South. Embers mentioned that, there's injustice everywhere. But that is bonded a lot of us together, that we're fighting for a better way, a different way, because we know kids deserve better. Families deserve better. Communities, our country. And I think that's part of what bonds us as a choice movement. We want better for everybody.
Yeah, and really it is the commitment to purpose. And Roblin would have opportunities. As a lawyer, there's a lot of other things that she could have done other than this. So being committed to the purpose, being drawn to it, making the choice of spending her time this way is just so inspiring for others who share her mission.
And I think to sort of summarize it all, as a policymaker, I've always felt that the most important thing we can do as policymakers is step back, remove the barriers, and let citizens take the lead. And in this case, 4 people, citizens, ordinary citizens, took the lead in ways that we never could have imagined. All we had to do was give them the freedom and unlock the barriers so they could move ahead.
Unleash, not control. And that's what you put into motion, Ember. We call it enabling legislation. And you open the doors to so many people. And just a heartfelt thanks to you and the team Minnesota that got it launched, and to all the people we've talked about and just highlighted. And, that's really key to why we do this. Chartering isn't about replicating the past. It's about writing the next chapter. So all of you that are out there listening, be bold and let's go. What are you going to write? What are you going to do? And what are you going to accomplish for kids?
That was beautifully said. I think I'll go straight into the close, family. In our next episode, we are going to wrap up this season. And in the continuation of that journey, we're going to really continue to look at some of the lessons that we've pulled from the first 30 years of chartering and thinking about how we can use those lessons for the future work that we all have ahead of us. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to commit to this show. So hit subscribe, follow us across our social media channels. That really helps us spread these messages and the movement even further. Until then, stay bold, stay mission driven, and stay in community. And we'll see you all same time next week.